In the previous lecture, we considered the surprisingly real possibility that psychopaths should be regarded as legally insane and not morally or legally responsible. But that's obviously a special case. In this last lecture, we'll consider more general questions about how reflections on free will, determinism, and responsibility might impact the law, as well as our everyday lives in certain respects. And then I'll conclude today's lecture by giving an overview of some of the central points that we've covered in the course. Perhaps the most famous case in which free will and determinism entered into legal argumentation was in the 1924 Leopold and Loeb trial. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb were teenagers from wealthy families, and they murdered a 14-year-old boy named Bobby Franks. This is cited as the classic case of a thrill killing. They killed the boy just for recreation, just to show how smart they were and that they could commit the perfect crime. Of course, it wasn't perfect at all. One of them dropped his glasses at the crime scene, which ultimately led to their unraveling and being caught. The renowned attorney Clarence Darrow was retained to defend the boys. The families were very wealthy, and so they could hire this very famous and excellent attorney. Because the evidence was overwhelming against them, he had them plead guilty, but his worry was about the death penalty. The public was clamoring for the boys to be executed, and Darrow took his mission to be to argue against the death penalty, to argue against them being executed. And in his legendary closing statement, he appeals to deterministic considerations. So he first offers a general explanation for their behavior. And I'm going to end up reading a bunch of quotes from the closing statement because it's so wonderful. So he says, quote, "Why did they kill little Bobby Franks? Not for money, not for spite, not for hate. They killed him as they might kill a spider or a fly, for the experience. They killed him because they were made that way, because somewhere in the infinite processes that go to make the making up of the boy or the man, something slipped." He also makes the point by talking about just one of the defendants, Richard Loeb. So he says, "Let us take Dickie Loeb first. What had this boy to do with it? He was not his own father. He was not his own mother. He was not his own grandparents. All of this was handed to him. He did not surround himself with governesses and wealth. He did not make himself, and yet he is to be compelled to pay." So here Darrow is bringing up the fact that this boy is somehow or other shaped by his environment and his past and his what he inherits from his parents, and that he is not responsible for what he is. Darrow goes on to say that only barbaric vengeance could be at play in thinking that it would be appropriate to execute the boys. So he says, "For God's sake, are we crazy? In the face of history, of every line of philosophy, against the teaching of every religionist and seer and prophet the world has ever given us, we are still doing what our barbaric ancestors did when they came out of the caves and the woods. Your Honor, I am almost ashamed to talk about it. I can hardly imagine that we are in the 20th century. And yet there are men who seriously say that for what nature has done, for what life has done, for what training has done, you should hang these boys." Darrow is here making an impassioned plea in terms that are familiar from philosophers like D'Holbach, that people's actions are determined. Loeb's action, as Darrow presents it, was an inevitable product of his upbringing. Nature is the ultimate source of Loeb's action, of Loeb's murdering Bobby Franks. This is the impression that Darrow's giving us. He's pressing us to think that, yeah, Loeb's action was a product of deterministic forces of nature. Nature drove him to this. So Darrow says it would be morally appalling to execute the boy for what nature did. Darrow insists that his view will prevail in the future, that this is the view that will carry forward. So he says, "I know the future is with me and what I stand for here, not merely for the lives of these two unfortunate lads, but for all boys and all girls. I know the future is on my side. Your Honor stands between the past and the future. You may hang these boys, you may hang them by the neck until they are dead, but in doing it, you will turn your face toward the past." Darrow won the case. Leopold and Loeb were given life sentences rather than the death penalty that the public was clamoring for. And he did this by playing up the kinds of considerations that we've seen before in the class, in this course, with Dolbach, that it looks like nature can explain why we end up the way that we are. If that's right, then how can we execute people for their actions? 21st century law has once again been gripped by these issues, and it's largely been inspired by the role of neuroscientific evidence in trials. Now, in cases of capital punishment, it's become fairly common to introduce evidence of brain abnormalities as grounds for excuse, as grounds for saying this person doesn't deserve to be executed because he has these things are happening in his brain that can give a kind of exculpation for him. For instance, in Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Perella, 2007, new evidence from neuroimaging was introduced to overturn the death sentence for Simon Perella. Perella had been sentenced to death in 1983 for a brutal murder he committed. And part of this, he had one of his victims injected with battery acid. But on appeal, attorneys used images of Perella's brain showing that he had abnormalities in the frontal lobes. And this was taken to support the contention that Perella was severely mentally disabled. In light of this evidence, his death sentence was overturned and he was resentenced to life in prison. This is just one case in what is now a growing trend to use brain imaging evidence in trials, and particularly in capital cases. Neuroscientific evidence is thus poised to reveal neurological factors that may play a role in the law, and particularly, it looks like it might be able to identify factors that play causally important roles in generating behavior. For instance, some studies reveal tumors in people who've committed crimes, and in some cases, the evidence suggests that if it hadn't been for the tumor, the person wouldn't have committed the crime. Some think that these sorts of considerations about what we find in the brain sciences will ultimately lead the law to give up the idea of guilt altogether. For ultimately, it's the aim of neuroscience to provide a framework in which all behavior can be understood in terms of brain activity. Again, this is reminiscent of Dolbach's vision that we could explain all of our actions in terms of the physical laws that govern the mind-brain. The idea is that once we appreciate that every action is caused by a chain of brain activity, that will show that no one is truly guilty. So if neuroscience is supposed to give us a complete causal story for all behavior, then this kind of argument would lead us to excuse every single action. University of Pennsylvania law professor Stephen Morse says that there is a basic error in some of this. There's a basic error in how many lawyers are trying to use neuroscientific evidence to excuse criminal conduct. And he writes, thinking that causation itself excuses, including causation by abnormal variables, he says, is, quote, the fundamental psycho-legal error. The mere fact, he says, that a cause has been identified in the brain somehow, that doesn't mean that the person is not responsible. And Morse has two somewhat different points here. First, he thinks that it's no excuse to identify a causal influence, that something influenced the behavior. So just like saying, well, the defendant has less inhibitions about hurting people, that would be no legal excuse for murder. So neither, Morse says, neither is it an excuse to identify a brain region that explains why the defendant has less inhibitions. Now, this is consistent with a broad range of views on responsibility. As I've mentioned a few times, remember that libertarians allow that there are causal influences on behavior. So it might be that some things that are happening in your brain affect your behavior, and you might be able to identify those with brain science. But that doesn't mean for the libertarian that your choice wasn't free, because they claim that even though there are influences, the influences aren't the whole story. I think part of what Morse's worry here is that people look at the brain images and they say, oh, that's why he did it. But at a minimum, that's to oversimplify the brain science. The kinds of actions that are at issue here are voluntary actions. They're not reflexes. And voluntary actions aren't the sort of thing that happen in isolation in some special region of the brain. Rather, voluntary decisions are typically produced by inputs from a variety of different sources. So for typical voluntary actions, no isolated brain image can tell a complete story about why a person did what he did. The most imaging data could do, in conjunction with other evidence, is indicate one causally relevant factor. So you might be able to identify something in the brain data that would allow you to say, well, this bit of neural tissue here, if he hadn't had that bit, he wouldn't have committed the crime. So in some sense, then, we would have identified a cause because we would have said that thing was crucial. But it wouldn't be the total cause. It would only be one of the causal factors, that if he hadn't had that particular thing, he wouldn't have done the action. But now let's consider in a bit more detail what this all is supposed to mean and how finding a cause in the brain would be relevant or not relevant. So let's just imagine that Rick kills his wife because he just hated her. We could say in that case, truthfully, that he wouldn't have killed her if he didn't hate her. It was only because he hated her that he killed her. But that would certainly not be a viable excuse in the court of law. I mean, imagine an attorney said, Your Honor, my defendant killed his wife, it's true, but you see, he's not guilty because he really, really hated her. Now, what if you then scanned his brain and then you find the place where Rick's hate resided? Let's say the hate is in his insular cortex. It would be weird to say that before we knew where his hate was, we were right to think that he was guilty for killing his wife. But now that we know that the hate is in the insular cortex, we must absolve him of responsibility. I mean, you might think, well, of course his hate is in his brain. Where else would it be? In his inner elbow? I mean, that does nothing to excuse him from being responsible. So if you think that Rick is morally responsible and legally responsible for killing his wife, even though he wouldn't have done it if he didn't hate her, then finding out that his hate is in his brain shouldn't give us a reason to excuse him. So that's one of Morse's points. Morse also, though, makes a more general claim that even if it turned out that all of our actions were determined or caused, he says, this still wouldn't be a significant legal excuse. So even if it turned out that determinism is true, that neuroscience gives a complete story about the causes of our behavior, he says that wouldn't change things because he says the law does not stipulate that an action can't be fully caused. He says the law makes no claims about legal implications of determinism. It doesn't say anything about determinism. There's nothing in the law, according to Morse, that would entail that we should alter our legal decisions if we found out that determinism is true. There's nothing there that says anything about determinism or has any implications that say anything about determinism. On this point, Morse is really falling in line with the compatibilist philosophy that we've seen earlier. That is, if it turns out that determinism is true, this will not and should not will not and should not mean the end of criminal guilt as we know it. In harmony with the compatibilist philosophers before him, Morse thinks that the proper notion of legal guilt, legal culpability, is entirely insulated from any worries about determinism. So we're beginning to see the historical debate between philosophers once again reach directly into the law. And throughout this, we see a recapitulation of the pull of conflicting ideas over whether people are truly responsible for their actions. In the early 20th century, Darrow represented a position that was akin to the free will skeptics. He said, look, these boys did what they did through nature. They aren't free. They weren't free agents. They shouldn't be held responsible and executed. So he held a kind of hard determinist position. Now, in the early 21st century, we find Stephen Morse representing a compatibilist position, that determinism is irrelevant. It doesn't matter that these boys were determined, he would say. They're still guilty by what we have in the law. So here we have different legal theorists carrying the flag for conflicting views. But even within the law itself, in everyday life, we actually find a conflict that's closely related to the problems of free will, responsibility, and determinism. And it shows up in a phenomenon that philosophers call moral luck. On the one hand, it seems like whether someone deserves to be blamed depends only on their freely chosen decision. As we saw in Lecture 16, we typically praise and blame based on a person's intentions, not the outcomes. Because often, whether the outcome is good or bad depends on luck, and it seems inappropriate to praise or blame someone based on luck. And here we feel the obvious pull, I think, of our commitment to free will. We think people should be blamed for their free choices, not for the stuff over which they have no control. Well, that all seems right. But then on the other hand, at least in cases of negligence, we do seem to allow luck to play a role in guiding how much we blame a person, how blameworthy we think they are. So imagine two parents, each of whom leaves his baby in the tub briefly so that he can answer a phone call. Both of them are gone the same amount of time. But in one case, the baby drowns. The other case, the baby's fine. The parent of the baby who drowned, it seems, has done something terrible, whereas the parent of the other child has been irresponsible, but not terrible. Luck here seems to affect our sense of blameworthiness in this case. We would say the lucky parent was careless, he shouldn't have done that. But we don't think of him as being deeply blameworthy. We don't assign a huge amount of blame to him. But the unlucky parent is responsible for something horrendous. Because of his negligence, the baby drowned. So even though the intentions of these two individuals were exactly the same, their free choices were exactly the same. They both chose to answer the phone and leave the baby in the bathtub. We condemn one of them significantly, the unlucky one. We think he deserves our deep disapproval, at least many of us do. So his bad luck seems to affect how we evaluate him morally, and that's why we get the label moral luck. His action elicits our strong blame because of moral bad luck. This conflict also shows up in our legal practices. So, if a person is driving under the influence and through bad luck runs over a pedestrian, he has committed a much more serious crime than another person driving under the influence, but through luck doesn't encounter any pedestrians on the way home. But let's say he still gets picked up on a DUI. By contrast, he's still lucky. He didn't kill anybody. The unlucky driver, who had the same level of negligence as the lucky driver, the unlucky driver may end up with a significant prison sentence. Some of these cases, people get years in prison. So even though the free choice of the individuals are exactly the same, each of them made the negligent choice to drive under the influence. Luck in the outcome determined significant differences in the way the law treated them. One of them incurs a much more serious legal punishment than the other. Or consider the fact that attempted murder is a less serious crime than murder, even if the only reason the attempt failed was pure luck. For instance, let's say the intended victim happened to move right before the bullet arrived. Again, we could run this with two individuals, both of whom intend to kill, but one of whom gets lucky and the victim ducks the bullet. The free choices of the individuals are exactly the same, but the person who didn't actually kill the intended victim would get a lighter sentence. And so luck seems to play a role here in what the law decides should happen. Even the Greek philosopher Plato, who lived from about 428 to 348 BCE, he acknowledged the oddity of this phenomenon in his work, The Laws. So this is a very early philosopher, a very important early philosopher, who recognizes this phenomenon. And he maintained that really the attempted murderer should be treated the same as the murderer. But then he goes on to qualify that, well, in the case of attempted murder, the person shouldn't be executed as a sign of respect for the role of fortune in the outcome. Or, as Plato put it, the wrongdoer should be spared as a thank offering to the deity and in order not to oppose his will. So Plato has the idea that, well, maybe there's some bigger picture about why the attempted murder why it didn't go through. But when we realize that luck does play a role in our judgments of blame, it raises a broad question. Should we simply accept that luck does matter after all for morality and legal responsibility? Or should we try to reform our moral and legal practices so that luck doesn't play a role in blaming and sentencing? The problem of moral luck and the emerging neuroscientific evidence put pressure on our moral and legal practices of holding people responsible. The pressure is by now familiar. On the one hand, we want to hold people responsible for their actions and outcomes. On the other hand, we think that people shouldn't be held responsible for their actions and outcomes, except insofar as they came from the person's free will. So if science convinces us that free will is an illusion, we seem to face a moral conclusion that is difficult to accept, that all criminals should be morally excused for their crimes. While we would of course need to implement measures to protect society from criminals, criminals should not be regarded as morally responsible. When faced with this prospect of absolving all criminal behavior, even those who think responsibility is incompatible with determinism can find themselves wavering. On the one hand, it seems intuitively unfair to hold people responsible if no one has free will. On the other hand, it seems obviously fair to hold criminals responsible for their actions. And so once again, we see common sense yielding conflicting attitudes, this time at the level of ethical concerns. As reflective adults, we have a variety of views about when people are responsible, when it's fair to hold them responsible, when it's unfair. Nearly everyone thinks that it is fair to hold criminals responsible. But most people also seem to think that responsibility is incompatible with determinism. So if we come to believe in determinism, we end up in a bind. It seems that we have to conclude that no one is really responsible. An alternative possibility has been developed recently by the philosopher Manuel Vargas, who's at the University of San Francisco. And his idea is that we just need to change the way we think about responsibility. So rather than give up the idea that people are responsible, we might give up our intuitive commitment to incompatibilism. That is, we can give up the idea that responsibility requires that we have libertarian free will, that we have the kind of free will that's inconsistent with determinism. So, on his view, we might elect to become compatibilists when faced with the prospect of having to morally absolve all criminals. As we saw before, Darrow argued that it would be a travesty to hang Leopold and Loeb for what nature did. He also told the judge that while the judge might rule in favor of hanging the boys, if he did, he would be reverting to a barbaric past. The future, Darrow proclaimed, was on the side of appreciating that people can't be held deeply responsible for what nature has done. Darrow prevailed in his defense of Leopold and Loeb, but it's less clear that he was right to claim that the future was on his side. The debate over free will, determinism, and responsibility has been with us for millennia, and it shows no sign of stopping. We've seen significant advances over the last 100 years, and in particular, I think, over the last several hundred years, but in particular, over the last 30 years. But there remain important areas where debate continues. And to bring this course to a close, I'd like to review some of the central points of consensus and some of the continued points of debate. So, as we saw early on, philosophers have distinguished several different strands of the notion of necessity. There's fate, divine predestination, and causal determinism. The last of these, causal determinism, the idea that everything that happens is causally inevitable, that it's caused by what happened before it and that's caused by what happened before it, all the way back to the beginning. That's the notion of necessity that has really endured through contemporary discussions of free will. Philosophers have distinguished several different notions of free will that are compatible with determinism, notions that require that determinism be false, and one issue that continues to inspire debate concerns which of these accounts, which account of what free will is supposed to involve, gives the best description of our everyday notions of choice and responsibility. But philosophers have largely come to agree that mere indeterminism, just having it that determinism is false, would not be enough to secure free will and moral responsibility. Randomness counts as indeterminism, but that wouldn't make us free and responsible. You need something more than that to get responsibility. So, one point on which most philosophers agree as a result of this is that it is very difficult even to explain what libertarian free will is. For on the one hand, it can't be determined, but on the other hand, it can't be random. Somehow the person has to produce the decision in a way that is neither determined nor random, but it's not clear what the alternative is. One important indicator of the seriousness of this problem is that some advocates of libertarian free will readily admit that this notion defies any easy characterization. So the very attempt to explain what free will in the libertarian sense could consist in remains a difficult puzzle to this day. In science, there has been considerable progress on the status of determinism. In physics, we know that simple versions of determinism in physics that were promoted for centuries are mistaken. That is, whatever else is the case, physics now maintains that the fundamental laws that govern the motion of physical objects diverge from the laws of Newton. And so they diverge from any simple deterministic model based on those familiar laws. So we know that the deterministic model of physics from the 18th century is not the right theory of physics. In neuroscience, we know that some of the elements of the brain behave deterministically, but other bits of the brain have not yet yielded to deterministic analyses. In particular, the behavior of synapses currently can't be given a deterministic explanation. And it remains possible that these indeterministic elements affect decision-making. So the case that we looked at in a little detail was the behavior of neurons in monkeys when the monkeys have to decide whether to look left or right to get their juicy reward. In certain conditions, these neurons behave in apparently indeterministic ways, and this apparent indeterminism might have been caused by the indeterministic behavior of the synapses, which itself might have been caused by fundamentally indeterministic processes at the quantum level. So it remains possible that fundamental physical indeterminism does affect decision-making. In psychology, we now have a much fuller picture of factors that influence our decision-making. That we have a kind of an impressive body of work that's being developed now that shows all the different things that can affect the way we make decisions. And we also know, partly as a corollary of this, that our own access to how our decisions are formed is strictly limited. Many of the things that contribute to decision-making are just not available to introspection. We can't just look inside our minds and see all the factors that influence our decisions or how we make our decisions. And this is an especially important fact if it's supposed to be that the way we tell that we have free will is simply by looking in on our own decision-making. For we know from the psychological research that such introspective processes have blind spots, that there's bits of our decision-making that we can't see. Despite these areas of agreement, there are key disputes that remain. So theoretical physics remains divided on whether determinism holds at the most fundamental level. Likewise, in psychology and neuroscience, theorists remain divided over whether the mind is fully deterministic or whether there are some indeterministic elements. In the case of neuroscience, we have a much clearer idea about which features of the brain are deterministic. But for brain activities that haven't been given deterministic explanations yet, it remains unclear what the future holds. It may be that eventually we will be able to explain, say, the behavior of synapses in deterministic terms. And in psychology, while psychologists have identified more and more factors that influence our decisions, we are manifestly nowhere near a complete story. That is, we're nowhere near having a complete account of decision-making that includes all of the different factors and how they get integrated to produce a decision. On prescriptive issues, we find perhaps the least consensus. First, when it comes to trying to foretell what will happen if people stop believing in free will, there are very different views. Some think there will be terrible consequences. Others see a bright new future. Still others think that we could expect things to be pretty much the same. These predictions about a future in which we give up the belief in free will obviously affect the prescriptions that people offer. So those who foresee catastrophe maintain that if we find out that we don't have free will, we shouldn't go around telling people. Others, like Darrow, think that the recognition that we don't have free will presents a moral injunction for radically transforming our social world. We should stop holding others and ourselves morally responsible for our actions. For no one really deserves anything. Whatever happens to us is either determined or random, and in either case, it isn't ultimately produced by us. Others maintain that we should reject any such radical upheaval. Some reject the upheaval because they think morality in no way requires it. Others reject upheaval because they think that while there are moral reasons to change our practices, on balance, we're far better off just sticking with the status quo. These are old and deep questions, and while we've seen how philosophers and scientists have advanced the debate between free will and determinism, This course doesn't pretend to provide a definitive answer. Rather, my goal was to give a balanced presentation of the most important philosophical arguments and scientific evidence to put you in a position to draw your own conclusions.